board minutes from 9:15. Board members, any comments about this? And if not, I would entertain a motion. Any board members want to make a motion to approve the minutes?
I will make a motion to approve the board minutes from September 15th, 2021.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Board Member Williams will second that.
Great, we have a motion from board member Sweet and a second by board member Williams. Any further discussion? All those in favor, say aye.
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 All those opposed, say nay. That motion carries. Thank you very much. That brings us down to our discussion action items, agenda item number 5, which is the approval of the fiscal year 2021 annual report. Staff recommends the board of directors approve the fiscal year 2021 annual report and authorize staff to submit the report to the state of Arizona and partner agencies as required in the master IGA. Lori, Patrice, you want to take it away? Oh, and you're muted. There you go.
Thank you, Board Chair Shimoni. Good morning, Board of Directors and Transit Advisory Committee. My name is Lori Batiste. I'm the Management Services Director. Next slide, please. So the annual report contains a summary of the activities, including performance data for all provided public transportation systems and an overview of the revenues and expenditures. Next slide, please. We'll start with a summary of the program's performance. Next slide, please. So looking back at fiscal year 2021, some of the highlights are listed here. I'm happy to say that Mountain Line maintained all programs and employees through the COVID-19 pandemic. There was continued focus on growing the paratransit taxi travel program for clients, and Mountain Line did receive in fiscal year 2021 to offset operations about $4.9 million in American Rescue Plan and CARES Act funds. And then staff also continued the planning process of a new downtown connection center. Next slide, please. So first we'll look at the City of Flagstaff. Next slide, please. So I'm looking at ridership for the City of Flagstaff. This monthly graph is used to show overall change in ridership by month over the last several years, while still tracking differences in Mountain Line bus, as well as specifically Route 10. Ridership was down throughout the fiscal year, but overall remained steady as we kind of got to the second half of the year. Next slide, please. So the performance measures look at passengers, hours, and cost to evaluate standards for effective and efficient services. For Mountain Line bus, passenger trips decreased 56%, with the average number of riders per day at 2,554. The total cost per hour was down 8 cents from the prior year. And just want to note that for Route 10, that is primarily college students, and that represents about 50% of annual trips. So being down that 56% is not unexpected, considering the changes to college students' learning environment during the time of the pandemic. Next slide, please. Oh, next slide, sorry. Or next button. Here you see the overall ridership trend for Mountain Line paratransit. Ridership continued to be much lower than in prior years, but overall it did begin to exceed fiscal year 2020 in the last quarter of fiscal year 2021. So we were happy to see it was starting to get back on track. Next slide, please. So this is the Mountain Line paratransit travel taxi program. And the top portion of this slide, where the data does combine City of Flagstaff and Coconino County trips for each month, whereas the graph at the bottom shows just the City of Flagstaff taxi program trips. So the first half of the fiscal year, did hold an average of about 394 trips per month. And then as we moved into the second half of the year, January through June 2021, that average did increase to 406 trips per month. So again, started to see a little bit of a rebounding as we close the year out. Next slide, please. And here are the performance measures for the City of Flagstaff programs. Paratransit performed 3.19 trips per hour, providing 6,289 trips to more than 200 clients. And the City Taxi provided 4,732 trips. That equates to about a savings of $607,000 compared to those same trips being provided in a van. Although demand was reduced by 61%, the operating and administrative costs only decreased by about 20%. And that was mainly due to the continued expenses that we incurred that were really unaffected by the reduced trips. So things such as utilities, professional services, insurance, we get charged those no matter what the ridership is. So in the next slide, please. Keep forgetting about that. Thank you. And so now we'll look at Coconino County. Next slide, please. So here you see the ridership for Mountain Line Van Pool. This program was initiated in December of 2015. And in fiscal year 2021, we had approximately 41 users in as many as 5 vans during peak service. Total trips were only down 3% from the prior year. So the van pool program really maintained the ridership pretty well over fiscal year 2021. Next slide, please. So again, just a reminder for this slide, the top portion data does combine City of Flagstaff and Coconino County taxi trips for the month. And then again, the bottom is just Coconino County this time. So Coconino County taxi trips averaged about 55 per month, and that really remained pretty steady. There was a slight uptick towards the end of the year, but overall, it looked pretty good this year or last year. Next slide, please. So looking at performance measures for Coconino County programs, Van Pool performed 8,646 trips, and that covered about 85,000 miles. This program only saw a 3% drop in trips, but the cost per trip did rise, and that was due to an increase in salaries and benefits that were allocated to that account, as well as some increased advertising that we did for this program. Whereas County Taxi provided 661 trips, and that demand dropped about 29%. Next slide, please. So we'll now move on to the financial summary. Next slide, please. So Mountain Line's revenue sources include contributions from each agency with service, the Arizona Department of Transportation and Federal Transit Administration. There's also fares and contract fees that we receive. So you can see here the revenues that are paid directly to Mountain Line. We do track them by source, and they're also tracked by service. And this just shows the breakdown of that by percentage as well as dollar value. Next slide, please. In fiscal year 2021, Mountain Line's total expenditures were $12,039,957, and that was for all operations and capital expenses. The actual expenses are tracked and compared to budget each month, and then financial reports are provided on a quarterly basis to our partner agencies. And this here shows a breakdown by each program. Next slide, please. So this shows how Mountain Line's total expenditures of $12 million were split between the various categories. It includes all operations and capital expenses, and then you can see obviously that salaries and benefits is our primary expenditure at about $6.8 million. Next slide, please. So our general fund does not support any staff, and so therefore there's no salary and benefit costs. The expenditures for this program are mainly sponsorships, memberships, and meeting and marketing services. Next slide, please. So the City of Flagstaff programs include our Mountain Line bus, paratransit, and city taxi programs. You can see here the bulk of the expenses are from salaries and benefits, and then that remaining $3 million is pretty closely split between the other categories. Next slide, please. And for planning, the operating expenses totaled about $256,000. Total expenditures were $2.2 million. For this program, we're able to capitalize wages, and that really does result in overall operational savings, as grant funding then results in savings to the city. So that is a difference there. And the next slide, please. So lastly is Coconino County. The operating total here was $72,000. There's no capital expenditures incurred for this program. And so you can see that split there. And that concludes the annual report. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that report. TAC members, board members, comments, questions, concerns? Yeah, go ahead.
Ryan here, the tailgated in and tailgated out today because he forgot his wallet.
Aaron,
So he was,
maybe mute yourself. There you go. Yeah, in all seriousness, does anyone have any comments or questions about the annual report? Please jump in.
Hi, this is Gail. I'm curious, how many employees does Mountain Line have overall?
I am actually not positive right this moment. Is there anyone on the line for our group? I don't believe we have an HR representative online right now.
Okay.
Is there anyone else online that might have a better number?
Yeah, this is Heather. I'll take a run at it. So our full-time equivalent employee list is just below 100 people. We do have several part-timers. We hire as many part-timers as we need to make our shifts work. So it's a very flexible number. But our full-time equivalent positions is just under 100 employees for fiscal year 2021. Granted, we did have a lot of vacancies that impacted how many employees were actually employed, but that gives you an idea of how many employees we expect to employ when we are fully staffed.
Thanks, Heather. Do you have an idea of how many part-time employees that you currently have on board?
Currently, I believe we have 3. It might be as many as 5. But like I said, we will hire as many part-timers as we can to help fill those schedules and shifts.
Super. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Heather.
Other questions? You know, Lori, the only thing that stood out to me when I went through the attachment was the paratransit and the city taxi programs and the operational cost per hour, and how specifically the paratransit, we've gone from 23,000 plus trips in fiscal year 2018 to 6,200 in 2021, but yet the operational cost has almost tripled. I'm sure there's reason for that. Can someone speak to that?
Laura, you want me to take a run at it?
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know if from
Yeah.
back, I don't have the.
So this is something we've spent a lot of time talking about. And so really a good reminder for all of us is to remember that we have to employ enough paratransit folks in our division to be prepared to provide services as demanded, because it is a regulatory program. And so even though we had that many less trips, we could not have staff scheduled and ready for those changes in demand when they occur. In addition to that, some of our contracts required social distancing. So then we couldn't maximize the number of people on a vehicle. So instead of sending a vehicle out for 5 or 6 passengers, we were sending a vehicle out for 1 passenger at a time. And so really during that diminished demand and those reduced service hours, we ended up with high cost because we did not lay anybody off, and we maintained most of our costs throughout the pandemic. It is something we continue to evaluate. The idea of the travel or the taxi travel program was, when possible, to shift those trips into a taxi, because it is much cheaper for us as the agency to provide that transportation over our vans and van services. But many passengers still choose to use the van services for a multitude of reasons. And by federal rules, we have to provide that service if they ask for it. So that is part of ongoing discussions. about how to continue to contain or control those paratransit costs. But it's a costly program across the nation for transit programs.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Heather. And then is it the same with the city taxi?
So with the city taxi program, it's actually I think our budget was about $67,000 and we came in around $99,000. Anytime we can shift a trip into a taxi program, we prefer to do that. If we have federal funding, we prefer to bring to put those trips into the taxi because we can offset that trip through our federal funding. The change in the cost per trip is really a change in our program. We used to give out vouchers that were $10 per trip vouchers. Now we give them $300 per month, which is the equivalent value of the vouchers, but they could choose to use that in a single trip if they want to do that. And so that has changed the trip length that people take and therefore the cost per trip. But the actual value that we offer to each customer is not significantly different in any of these fiscal years.
Okay, thank you for that. Other questions, directors and TAC members?
It's Erin. It's not a question, but just for future presentations, it was kind of hard when you split county and then city. If there was just a way to keep them either separated so we can compare them. I was trying to do the math in my head, taking out the city trips based on the total of county and city. So it just makes it a little harder to absorb.
Thank you for that, Erin.
Any other comments or questions?
And sorry, it's Erin again. Sorry. The only other thing I'll say is hats off to trying to keep really continuing service as well as you guys did through COVID.
Thank you.
Cheers to that. Absolutely.
Mr. Chair, this is Shane. I just want to echo Erin's comments, both of them. I appreciate her observation on making all this data a little more digestible. The suggestion, I think, hits and resonates well with me. And I also want to join my voice with hers in accolades to the effort by Heather and her team in managing all of this through COVID. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Dale. We appreciate it. Any other comments or questions? And if not, board members, I will definitely entertain a motion.
Chairman Shimoni, this is Director Williams. I move to approve the fiscal year 2021 annual report and authorize staff to submit the report to the state of Arizona and partner agencies as required in the master IGA.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Great. We have a motion to approve from Director Williams with a second from Director Sweet. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed say nay. That motion carries. Thank you so much. That brings us down to agenda item 6, which is our financial update. The board may provide direction, but there is no recommendation from staff at this time. Heather.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, and committee members for our Transit Advisory Committee. Our agenda today is a little different than other strategic advances. We are going to spend the bulk of our time talking about Flagstaff in motion. We did have the small business item that Lori covered, and then really the point of the next one is to give you an idea of where our financial picture is so that when we go into Flagstaff in motion, you have a clear understanding of where do we stand with our financial funding sources so that can aid in decision and discussion. So with that, I'll provide a brief update on our different funding sources. Next slide. I wanted to illustrate fares first. So fares is something we spent some time talking about as we entered COVID conditions and we dropped ridership. And you can see in fiscal year 2021, we had a significant decrease in our fares. I want to say this does not include what Northern Arizona University contributes in lieu of fares for students. This is actual fares collected through our sales mechanisms and from passengers on board the vehicles. The good news is that we anticipated this change in our fares, and you can see actually in 2021, we anticipated or projected fares would be 265, and we actually ended the year at 284. And I will go one step further and recognize this number is slightly different than what Lori presented, because her number in the annual report combines multiple categories of fares. And again, this is just fares collected on the vehicles. In 2022, we budgeted fares to be at 638,000 across our programs, and we're right now predicting that we will come in at 630,000. So from a fares perspective, we feel like we are in a good place with the predictions that we've made, and with the ridership rebounding, expect to end the year at least on budget. Next slide. At the onset of COVID, prediction was that we would have a gap or loss of transit tax revenues of about $1 million. That was done through coordination and conversations with the city of Flagstaff, who's really the fiscal agent for the transit tax that's collected, calculated, and projected. In the fiscal year 2022 budget setting presentation, we actually were seeing an increase, not a decrease as originally projected. So all told, when we ended in July of 2021, when we ended fiscal year 2021, we projected another increase to that transit tax. And so the revenue increase posted in 2020 and 2021, along with future projections, results in a $4.8 million increase to our transit tax revenue over the next 5 years. Next slide. Switching gears to look at the federal picture. If I didn't have the CARES and the American Rescue Plan or ARP funds in here, because those were one-time funds, I just want to recognize we would still have a $1.2 million increase in federal funds over the next 5 years. 5307 funding is an appropriation of funds based on population and density for the greater Flagstaff area, and those funds are eligible for operating assistance. So again, these funds equaled an $11 million plus up to our operating revenues available for transit services. 5307 does include our performance benchmark money, small transit intensive cities funding. And you'll notice that in 2023, we're showing that the 5307 will drop from 2.8 to 2.6. And that is related to a rule that FTA made in 2020 regarding STIC and the calculation of STIC. So essentially they froze all the benchmarks for several years of appropriations. We anticipate that when they unfreeze those benchmarks, we will drop from 6 benchmarks to 5, because that has traditionally been what we have received. And so conservatively, that's what we are using in our projection. Next slide, please. So if we talk about how we can use those funds as we move forward, we've done a couple of scenario projections for you. One is a Route 8 expansion. So Route 8 has been on our horizon for several years and in our financial plan. And as a result, I wanted to show you that if we implement Route 8 in 2023, what does that do to our fund balance? So the Route 8 is expected to cost us roughly $240,000 per year to implement. And you can see in 2030 that we are still above the 25% fund balance requirement, but we are steadily declining after we implement in 2023. Next slide. The next scenario done to illustrate how our fund balance changes is the implementation of battery electric buses as prescribed in the zero emission bus transition plan. The move to battery electric buses really starts to impact us in 2026 and increases our operating cost by roughly $200,000 per year. And that's related to the on-route charging that will need to be conducted during peak APS surcharge times. Next slide, please. With all that told, there are some potential changes that we have not assumed in our financial plan, and I just want to briefly walk through several of those. The drafted infrastructure bill currently being discussed in Washington, D.C. does have a plus up of 30% for transit programs. That would be about $9 million in additional federal funds to our community. And those funds are eligible for operating. My one word of caution is if we use those funds for operating assistance, it reduces how much we have for our capital projects and it increases our dependency on federal funds for operating. We are actively pursuing conversations with Arizona Public Service about electricity and electricity rates. We're seeking discounted charge rates to help with our increased cost. It's a key strategy that's happening across the nation in transit as systems look to go to electric buses or battery electric buses. And we know the City of Tucson was recently successful with their power company. So we are pursuing those conversations. While Flagstaff in Motion is going to help guide us on what service options should be a priority, including evaluation of the proposed service to Northern Arizona Healthcare, we will continue to talk with Northern Arizona Healthcare and the city about how to prioritize that service and then fund it. And lastly, the Arizona Transit Association has begun pursuing conversations with leaders around the state of Arizona about state funding for transit. Separate from ASTA's efforts, Mountain Line has begun those same conversations, looking at funding for key projects or match for that potential new federal funding coming to our area. Next slide, please. So it's my very brief update, but I will just say, as we continue our Flagstaff in Motion conversation, I'd like to review one more time where we are at with both secured and projected funding. And if you'll click, the fund balance is really what we have to plan for our future, whether that is implementing Route 8 or implementing zero emission buses or doing something else like NAH or other transit priorities identified through Flagstaff in Motion. With that, that's my very brief financial update to lead us into the Flagstaff in Motion discussion, but I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Heather. Board members and TAC members, comments and questions about this financial update? Give you all about a minute to think about it.
It's Erin. So obviously there's a concern, I mean, we want to go battery electric, but there's a concern when that fund balance crisscrosses. I know that, and you guys are probably going to give an update, and I apologize, on the fare study. I mean, I assume you're looking at other places to adjust funding to support battery electric, and I assume fares is part of that.
So yes, we are looking at what we can do with fares. So that could include a fare change, but I will tell you the strategies that we are focused on right now could potentially reduce our fare collection, not increase collection. So we have been looking at fare collection from an equity and accessibility standpoint. So things like fare capping, which allows someone to receive the same discount of a monthly pass as they pay throughout the month. And so that could change one-way cash paying customers into that same discounted monthly rate. So we believe, and we're getting close to having some information on modeling that, that could reduce our fares. Outside of that, you are correct. The board could consider fare increases, whether it's one-way increases or increases to our period pass rates. And then, yes, we continue to look at what are those other funding mechanisms that we could use in our community. So we continue to pursue the residential pass programs, talk about how EcoPass could expand and bring in some more revenues to us. We really believe that the state's ability to potentially contribute could help us as well with those capital offsets.
Is it possible at all? So with the program you just described with regards to equity, so the more they use, kind of the less they pay, if I'm capturing it right, is it possible we might see more people sign up because of a program like that, and that actually might help to counterbalance the lost revenue?
Yes, it has that potential. It will probably take time to see that
Absolutely, yeah.
counterbalance, but that is, so right now we're working with our contractor to model some of that behavior based on what's seen in the industry. And I really hope to have some of those results for the board next month, if not in January.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Other comments and questions?
Good morning. This is David Wessel. Heather, could you expand a little bit on your concerns about the federal funding and the increased dependence on federal funding
Sure.
if the new legislation passes?
So I don't think that the new legislation passing necessarily directs us to increase our funding, our dependency on federal funds, sorry. I think that if we said we are going to use that 9 million just for operating, it has the net impact of increasing our dependency. And I think that if we go back to Mountain Line's financial management policies, we are one of the policies that we have and have had in place for a very long time is that when possible to reduce that dependency on federal funds for operating and reserving that federal funding for our capital and capital programs. So operating assistance is 50-50, and if we reserve it for capital, it's 80-20, which makes that federal funding go further in our community.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Mr. Chair, this is Shane. I did have my hand up.
Oh, go ahead. Shane.
I think we have a very strong fund balance policy at 25%. I think that's notable. I also recognize that fund balance, anything in excess of that, is really good fiscal management as well. I am concerned. I know that we're looking out quite a few years, but realistically, 2030 is going to be on us before we know it. We all know how time flies, and so I'm just curious. I'm not necessarily concerned about the downward trend of fund balance if it's planned that way and it's managed. So I'm curious if Heather could elaborate a little bit more on the vision and how we ensure that we are not going to threaten or jeopardize that 25% fund balance with what we're seeing here, because the picture that's in front of our eyes right now doesn't show an answer. It shows a continued decline and a problem in my mind. So I'm just hoping Heather might share some of her vision with how this eventually turns a corner and we see a trend line that is either matching the fund balance line or is in excess of that line. Thank you.
Sure. So there's a couple strategies in our financial plan that are illustrated here. I will say that right now we only show through 2030 because that's actually when the transit tax sunsets. So we have always in history shown our financial plan to match those sunset periods of our tax. The trend line going down, I agree, is concerning because it is approaching that fund balance. There are several things that are assumed in our financial plan that could change that projection, meaning if our operating costs and our revenues don't align, then we could defer bus replacement, which is currently in here at end of life of those vehicles. And we know the vehicles are lasting longer than anticipated as one. So we have a set aside for that capital replacement that could be diverted to operational assistance. Internally, we've had a lot of conversations about the tax that was passed and renewed in 2016 and how it does or doesn't reflect the current cost of operations and what we will need to do to educate voters and potentially seek an increase to the tax just to continue performing service as we have it today. So I don't have a precise answer for you, Shane. I just wanted to cover some of those strategies that we are looking at and considering that could change that trajectory.
Thank you, Heather. Mr. Chair, one follow-up question to that response.
Go ahead, please.
Heather, in 2024, what
Mhm.
decision point is being made here that begins the downward trajectory in your fund balance?
So several things happen between 2023 and 2026 that don't, in 2024 and beyond that don't exist in 2023. We bring the DCC building online, and that's an increased operating cost that we don't have today. We implement Route 8, which is an expense we don't have today. I'm sorry, this does not assume Route 8, but this does assume that increased cost for the building. So it's about $110,000 to $125,000 a year in increased O&M cost for the DCC, and that we are currently showing is coming online in 2024. We also start vehicle replacement with vehicles starting to age out in 2024, 2026, and 2028. And then that is also taking money out of that fund balance to match the potential federal grant to replace those vehicles.
So I would, in closing, at least on this particular slide, Mr. Chair and members of the committee and board, I would just suggest that prior to, the DCC is moving forward full steam ahead, and we're all, including city staff, working tirelessly to support that endeavor. So I'm not suggesting holding that decision point up, but I am suggesting that with that factor in mind, that's an inevitability that's going to play out. We better understand what those decision points are and in advance, and we are making sure that we are tacitly giving a head nod to move in those directions prior to those decisions being made, because once those decisions are made, we are committing ourselves to this downward trajectory. And unless we have a solution in place that corrects that downward trajectory over time, well, you can just draw the dots out yourself, and we reach a conclusion that is not favorable. So I just wanted to lay that on the table. I appreciate looking years out ahead. I think it's an advantage to all of us in our seats today, and it's an advantage to those who replace us down the road. We definitely want to make sure that we're making good fiscally sound decisions today so that tomorrow is the promise that it's meant to be for everybody else. And I'm confident with Heather at the helm that we'll be making those decisions the right way. I just wanted to throw my comments out on the table in caution. Thank you.
Thank you, Shane.
Thank you, Chair. Delia, we appreciate that. Any other comments or discussion on this topic? Okay, let's go on and move on to the Flagstaff in Motion Community Transit Plan interactive discussion with Busy.
Hi, thank you, Chair, members of the board and Transit Advisory Committee. I am Busy Collins, Transit Planner for Mountain Line. I am joined today by members of the AECOM team. Rhonda did list them off earlier, but we do have Darren and Monica and Daksha. Robert will be joining us here shortly, Andrew and Tyler. So just want to call them out, and a few of them will be presenting some items as we go through. And next slide, please, Rhonda. This is the agenda that we'll be talking about for the next 2 hours. We do have a 5-minute break scheduled around 11 a.m. So hang tight if you can, and appreciate your patience. So we'll be going through the needs assessment. So understanding what are the needs that we understand from data and I'll provide some data here, and also what we're hearing from the public. So a summary of what we heard in public involvement phase 1, And then a bit of a synthesis between them to just identify how our Flagstaff community transit needs look as we combine those two aspects. And then the next item will be the evaluation criteria. So how are we measuring potential solutions to best meet our goals for this plan? And then we'll have potential funding sources. So how do we fund these things? We don't have the solutions identified yet, but we do just want to talk high level on potential funding sources. And then the potential use of the fund balance. Heather did an incredible job really introducing that fund balance component. There are some options, but I think we have some good information today to at least enable the board to give us some direction on that potential use of fund balance. And we do welcome questions and comments throughout the presentation. I also have some prompts for the board and TAC to respond. And in hopes of hearing from all of you, I plan to call on one of you each time to respond first and then open it up to see if there's others. So I have some very specific prompts, but throughout the presentation, feel free to ask some questions if you need clarification on anything or if you have comments. We welcome all of those. Next slide, please, Rhonda. So let's just remember where we were at in May when we kicked off the Flagstaff in Motion plan with the board and the TAC. So we did ask this question: with any new funding, how should Mountain Line prioritize new services? And staff took this as direction on how we move forward with this plan update. And as you can see, the top two items, target areas with highest ridership potential, that was number one. And number two was support transit dependent populations. And then everything else kind of fell quite a bit lower. However, I do see some of these supporting the first two priorities. And we also captured those remaining four priorities in the evaluation criteria that we'll be covering later today. So yes, and just a reminder, Board and TAC was able to select up to 3 choices. So that's why there's so many answers, but just really trying to understand priorities. And I think we got very good direction in May. And so next slide, please, Rhonda. Staff took that direction and really focused in on the needs assessment to try to accomplish those first 2 priorities. So I'm going to start with the first priority, target areas with highest ridership potential. Next slide, please. And this is a reminder of the ridership recipe. So how do we get high ridership? And it's 4 components. Density, so how many people, jobs, and activities are near each transit stop. And I love this quadrant because it shows what's good and what's more challenging to achieve that ridership component. So when there's a lot of people and jobs within walking distance of transit, you're most likely to have high ridership. When they're spread out, when it's less dense, it's not as high ridership potential. And as that density continues to decrease, the ridership potential decreases as well. Walkability, can people walk to and from the stop? I think the lower circle looks like a lot of neighborhoods in Flagstaff, and that's challenging. We have some great areas that have a good grid. We also have some incredible pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure in our community, even on some of those more circuitous roads. And another component to consider for walkability is, can you cross the street? I'll be bringing that up a little later as we identify some needs. Linearity, so can transit run in a reasonably straight line? Again, I think some of our Flagstaff areas look like the lower one, but we have some great corridors that work really well for transit. And then last, proximity. Does transit have to traverse long gaps? So shorter distances, kind of going back to that density component, very good. Long distances, a little bit longer for passengers, just not as ideal to capture that ridership. And as we identify areas of need in the Flagstaff community, you'll see that there's often one or more of these ingredients missing. Next slide, please, Rhonda. And I apologize, I can't see any hands. So if you do have questions, please maybe just speak up, just interrupt me. I appreciate that. So some data. First, I want to explain the map on the bottom right. So this map shows density of people, people in homes, where people live, and where people work, jobs. So people are red, jobs are blue, and that overlap is purple. And so the highest density of people and jobs is dark purple, and that has the highest potential for ridership. Density of just people in dark red and jobs in dark blue will have medium high ridership potential. And you can, okay, so our current route system is overlaid on this data. And you can see that our current routes are doing a really great job hitting those highest ridership potential areas. They're the dense areas, the purple, that have proximity between people and jobs. We are using the linear paths available, historic Route 66, Forest Cedar Lockett, Butler, we're Lone Tree Corridor, really hitting the main corridors and not getting into a lot of the circuitous neighborhoods. Most areas are walkable. Again, road crossings are sometimes a barrier, and stop spacing. So I'm not showing any stops on this map, but there are areas with long gaps between stops on our current routes that don't enable good service to high ridership potential areas. So I'd like to highlight the red corridor, that's historic Route 66, and that is our bus Route 66. We have very long distances. We hear very often that people want more stops along this corridor. You can see that there's a whole lot of purple there. There's also a whole lot of blue. So there's great ridership potential. The stop placement is challenging. It's an ADOT corridor. They have some limitations on how bus stops can be placed along their right-of-way. So that really limits how Mountain Line can best serve the public along that corridor. A couple others. Yes,
sorry,
please.
it's Erin. Sorry, you said to jump in. I think the other thing to point out that some people might not realize is the more stops, the longer it's going to take. And I'm sure people don't want it to take longer. They want you to stop more and still get them there as quickly. And so you'd have to add another bus to that route in order to maintain the timing, right? Actually, I think you still couldn't. If you stopped more, it's just going to take longer, period.
That's a great point, Erin. I appreciate that. That is a consideration, absolutely. More stops, increased dwell time. However, we only stop if people are using that stop. Travel patterns are really variable. So just the ability to have, to connect to the bus route with that new stop, there may not be people there all the time, but at least it gives people the ability to use it when they want. And another great point is, our current route system, we don't have any express routes. And that is something that we do hear from the public that Monica will cover shortly. So thinking that we add some more stops, but then potentially do we serve certain stops as an express route? Do we serve, I think there's some flexibility, but just wanted to point out that stop placement is a really important factor. The line may be going by your neighborhood, but if it's over a mile in any direction to get to a bus stop, that's very limiting. Any other questions before I move on? Great. So a couple other areas that stop spacing is challenging. Milton, again, a lot of purple, a lot of blue. It's very high ridership potential. Our stop spacing is pretty far between each stop, and it isn't the most walkable corridor. It's not a very enjoyable space to be in. So another area is Butler and Huntington. So the green line, green and purple, is part of our Butler, and then Huntington, again, a lot of blue, whole lot of jobs. And yes, those are the ones I wanted to point out. And then So I'm gonna finish with the routes, and then I'm just gonna pause to make sure the map and my approach makes sense. So let me just move into the ranking on the left. So that is a list of routes in order of the potential additional ridership that we might expect if we improved service from what is currently in place today. So improved service could be span, so earlier mornings, late nights, or frequencies. That could be during the weekdays, that could be earlier morning, later at night, that could be weekends. And like, for example, Route 10 is low on this list. However, it's the dark maroon line that goes right through NAU campus over to Woodlands Village. You can see it's going through a whole lot of purple and some dense, people, red, jobs, blue. So it has great ridership potential. And we see that on our routes. However, it has 8 to 10 minute peak frequency and 20-minute off-peak frequency. So adding more buses there, we don't see a whole lot of return on investment with that. So that's why it ranks very low. Another example is Route 5. You see that it's ranked as medium high. So Route 5 is the orange route. It goes around Thorpe Loop to the hospital and then up Fort Valley Road to Cheshire. And you can see most of the colors in that area, either like Thorpe Loop is pretty low density, it's white. And then it's a lighter shade of red or purple, depending on what side of Fort Valley Road you're on. And then Cheshire comes up as a medium high density area for homes. And we ranked it in the medium high because it is our lowest frequency route. So at 60 minutes, it's not a very attractive route to take. It's challenging to catch that bus, as we talked in May. And we know that increasing frequency increases ridership as well. So as we saw on Route 2, just increasing from 30 minutes to 20-minute frequency, we saw almost a 30% ridership increase. So just think what an increase in ridership could come from going from 60 minutes to 30 minutes. A couple other things I want to point out. The ranking also reflects how our system works on a pulse and hub format. So the routes pulse to connect services to one another, so passengers have a reliably short wait to transfer. For example, again, Route 5, it pulses from the downtown connection center, right where the word Flagstaff is, north on Fort Valley Road to Cheshire, loops back, heads south to DCC. So it's pulsing from the DCC out to the areas and then returning. That works really well when our routes have the same frequency. So everything runs on 20 minutes or 30 minutes or increments of each other that they can meet at the downtown connection center or the mall connection center at the same time. Short transfer period, quick crosstown movement, great connections, right? As we have within our system, we have 60 minutes, we have 30 minutes, we have 20 minutes, we have 8 to 10 minutes. And those routes they meet up about once per hour very well at the downtown connection center. We meet at the mall connection center pretty good. There's 2 20-minute routes, 1 30-minute route. So again, when the 20 and 30 or the 60, doesn't quite meet up very well, it causes people to wait longer at the downtown connection center. And that increases your travel time by bus, makes transit a little less attractive. That's definitely a big impact. Let's see. So that's what I want to point out at this map. I wanted to pause for questions on the map or the approach. Okay, I'm not hearing anybody. I don't know if there's any hands raised.
I guess, Mr. Chair, this is Shane. Busy, I think I'll jump in. I know that this is really evaluating the current system and what you could do in the current system to improve ridership. Is there a map that shows current system potential compared to a new route altogether potential?
Thank you, Member Dilly. At this stage, we're really in needs assessment. I would say that is a solution. And the next slide will be the coverage component. So where are we currently serving today? And then what's outside of our walkshed of the current transit system? And so I think that'll get to your question. So please.
Yeah, I get, thanks, Busy. Just to put a finer point on what I was trying to convey is all of these potentials have a dollar amount affixed to it.
Absolutely.
If there happens to be a new route that has a greater return on the dollar in comparison to what we're seeing in our current system, I guess that's where my mind was tracking. And specifically, I'm thinking about the reality in the next few years of having a relocation of the hospital and what kind of potential that introduces with the connection to the airport and so on and so forth. So that's where my mind was going, and I thought I'd just raise the question that way. I apologize if it was poor delivery. Thanks.
No, I appreciate that. And maybe if we cover the next slide, I think it'll address your question. Something that came to mind that I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're asking, but the lines where we're currently serving, so orange, blue, purple, in my mind, maybe there is a better way, a connection that better serves these areas, that provides increased frequency. Not sure. Again, we're in problem identification, and in the solutions component, and in the next step of this process, we're looking at that universe of options. Not sure if that was part of your question, but that's what also came to my mind. Maybe there was a second question out there. Okay, hearing none. I'm going to go on to the next slide. Please interrupt me if you do have a comment or question. Thank you, Rhonda. So again, focusing on that top priority, targeting areas with highest ridership potential. So now I am talking about areas that are beyond a quarter-mile walkshed of our current routes. So again, now we're thinking, let me make sure that the areas that I'm referring to, that we're all on the same page. So West Route 66 on bottom left in the purple, it's really referring to a whole big area, basically everything beyond that Route 8, the teal route there, that's outside of a quarter-mile walkshed. That could be Railroad Springs, that could be Presidio, Woody Mountain Road and the various developments that are going in there, Boulder Point, down low. So I guess I lumped that very broadly. Another place to bring up is, let's see, Greenlaw, I think comes up a lot. Sometimes it's East Flagstaff in our public involvement plan, but we have Sunnyside. So where the purple line is looping around in the center right top of that map. We have Sunnyside on the left where the purple really loops around. And then we have Greenlaw on the right. So they are different census tracts. And so it's referred to in different ways. It kind of lights up, as you can see, in different ways. We can see, for example, Sunnyside, that is just south of our Route 7 purple line. It's really bright here. So we're saying very high density of people and jobs. There are some areas there that are beyond the quarter-mile walkshed. And, maybe that's just, again, we're in needs assessment. Some of these areas, transit doesn't make sense. We have some transit, maybe improved pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure makes the most sense. Maybe microtransit, maybe it's a bike share. Again, we're just trying to identify what are the problems that we need to solve with this plan. And I also want to bring up that there's a few areas on the map that don't show up. So let's see, the WL Gore West Campus. You can see that where the Flagstaff Ranch bottom left is, and that's where the Gore campus is. You can see it's no density. It's very, very low density. It doesn't even show up as a color. But that's a major employment center for our community. Something else, let's see, airport, it's off the map, I apologize, but it also does not show up. It's a very isolated destination in a very light, medium low dense area of Ponderosa Trails. The hospital also does not show up. It's a future location. It's not going to show up here. And then another very important destination is the Nestle Purina campus factory that is in kind of far right. It's in the blue section south of the mall. I'm sure you're all familiar, but it's somewhat captured by that census tract in the Huntington Industrial Corridor. And so here we have listed, really based on ridership potential, areas that are beyond the quarter-mile watershed of our current routes. So West Route 66, very large umbrella term. We see a lot of high ridership potential. However, there's some barriers. There's a few very linear ways to get there. And then there's a whole lot of circuitous neighborhoods off of that. Walkability and linear components kind of play in. New hospital location asterisk means there's a lot of unknowns here. It's a phased in project. It'll be very interesting to see how that area develops around the hospital.
Izzy, I'm gonna jump in. Gail has her hand up.
Oh, thank you, Gail, please. Member Jackson.
Thank you. Busy, I appreciate all of these maps. These are great info. And I want to compliment some of what Shane was saying is the airport seems to be left out of some of these. And there is development that is happening around the airport in terms of, there's spaces for lease. There is a new tech park, business research park that's being developed. I'm just curious if that's being looked at. I mean, I appreciate that the hospital is moving out there. That's, 7 years down the road. We have, the hospital or the airport's done a great job of increasing flights in and out of the airport. And I'm just wondering, where does that fit in this plan?
Yeah, thank you, Member Jackson. So here we're really focusing on targeting areas with highest ridership potential. As going back to that ridership recipe, the proximity airport is pretty. I understand that maybe there's some jobs, a number of jobs in the airport area. It's a very long distance to get there. So just focusing on ridership potential, I agree. It's an employment center. It's a destination, and I think it's an important destination for our community. But if our top, again, just focusing on top priority from the board, highest ridership potential. And I do want to take those comments into consideration because I agree there's some components that aren't rising to the top when we look at it just through the top two priorities. And I think that's something that needs to be captured in our needs assessment and in how we identify solutions as well.
Busy, if I can add on this topic of the airport, since we're chatting about it with the TAC here too, just let the TAC members know that the board is hopefully going to be having a meeting with leadership from NAH and the airport and also the city to talk about the traffic impact analysis and try to get somewhere in this discussion in terms of how are we moving forward with the new facility being proposed for NAH. It all comes down to money, right? But we're trying to figure out how to make this a win-win for the community and for Mountain Line being the glue in moving people out to that new location, while also maybe reaching the county, Fort Tuthill, and also the airport. But it is a challenge, but we are working through that and appreciate the TAC support in that effort and maybe even engagement in that board meeting. Just wanted to throw that out there. Thank you, Busy.
Thank you, Chair Shimoni. I think Dave has his hand raised as well.
Thank you, Busy. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate and applaud the Mountain Line effort and including the board's effort to address the needs at the new hospital location in the airport. And just remind people, I think Gail mentioned that we're talking about 7 years out for a hospital. I imagine the research park she referenced is on a similar time frame, and that this is a 5-year transit plan. Meanwhile, Metro Plan, working with Mountain Line and other partners, we're working on our regional transportation plan, which is a 20 to 25 year look. And we can look at these similar types of metrics in terms of ridership potential and trying to develop potential over time, and means to do that. So just a reminder there. Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Thank you for that. Director Vasquez.
Yes, thank you. First off, I just want to commend the staff on putting together some really cool maps that are explaining a lot of different information all at once. And so I'm really impressed with that and appreciate it. My question, as we were going through and talking about the effects of the FMC leaving, do we have any idea like what percentage of ridership is attributed to where FMC is now? In other words, when this does finally move, how's it going to affect ridership on those current routes?
Absolutely. Great question, Director Vasquez. I appreciate that. I don't have that information right at my fingertips. I'd be happy to pull that up as once I get a break from this presentation, but I can say that it is quite a high ridership stop. It currently is served every 20 minutes between 2 different routes, Route 2, Route 5. It is a major destination there. We have excellent use of the EcoPass program by the hospital staff. We have very good use of the stop by people going to the hospital. So I apologize, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I'd be happy to pull that up and come back later in the conversation with that.
No problem. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Great. Any other questions before I move on? I love the conversation. This is great. So I'm going to move on to the next priority, and you will see these priorities come in combining the first and second priorities in a matrix a little later. So happy to talk through this. Just want to make sure we can get to all of the items. Next slide, please, Rhonda. So focusing on the second priority, supporting transit-dependent populations. Next slide, please. Staff created a combination of maps. So this is the process here. We have a map on the top right of poverty, so people falling below the poverty line, and how many people per square mile that are affected. Another example is minority on the bottom right. So again, darker the color, the more people affected by that category. And so we combine demographic populations into one analysis, combining minority, low income, seniors, youth, people with disabilities, zero car household, limited English proficiency, and essential jobs. Essential jobs, we remember that from COVID. So trying to combine all of that to really identify where the most people who are prone to mobility challenges are located, so we can best support transit-dependent populations. Next slide, please. And so this map combines all of those components. And you can see the high is the darker green color. So that really lights up in the NAU area, Butler, Industrial, Huntington Corridor, Pine Knoll is kind of where the Cogbill Center is label is identified, and then East Flagstaff. So there's that Greenlaw component, Swiss Manor, Upper Greenlaw really lights up. So those are high areas, and then above average are kind of the greenish teal. So we got our Sunnyside and West Route 66, some areas along Milton, La Plaza Vieja. So with that, we don't have our routes colored here, but we identify the ranking of routes that serve those areas. Next slide, please, Rhonda. And in the same approach, these are areas that are beyond the quarter-mile watershed of our system. And again, prioritizing, or rather ranking, the various locations according to this priority. So we can see the hospital, again, major major location to support those transit dependent populations. And then going down the list, and I'm going to pause there briefly. The next slide is the matrix. And we just have a couple more minutes for my slides, but happy to answer any questions if you have them right now. All right, moving on to the next slide. So this is combining high ridership potential with supporting our transit dependent populations. You can see that not everything is pitted against each other. There's some overlap, which is great. It can achieve both our top goals. For example, the new hospital location. We do see that there is potential to achieve some high ridership and support our transit dependent populations. Route 66 is our bus route 66. And then to the left of that, West Route 66, that's that whole area, very umbrella term, along historic West Route 66 area. So I'm going to pause here. And I do want to know if, so public input will also help rank these needs, but just on these two top priorities, I definitely heard that some key information, are like important community destinations such as the airport. Is there anything else any other key information that we're missing to rank these needs? And another prompt, let's see.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Yes, please.
So when you're referring on this index areas outside of city, is that referring to like Donny Park, Fernwood Timberline, Kachina Village, those areas?
Correct.
Okay. And how did they end up so low on the priority matrix?
So for ridership potential on the left, it's just very low density, very home focused areas. So less dense, long distance to them, the proximity line. And then that it's just population, or sorry, just people and homes, kind of brings it lower there. Supporting transit dependent populations, those maps really show up, again, it relies on density, density of people that are in some of those more vulnerable population groups. So minority, low income, we really didn't see those areas light up, the bedroom communities light up with those, with that data.
No, great. Thank you for clarifying that. Appreciate it.
Great. Okay. So, so in your opinion, I want to start with Member Williams. In your opinion, are the highest needs rising to the top? And that would be the orange is kind of the top right corner.
Yeah, I think from what I understand, I think those probably are the areas that stand out.
And then just opening up to the board and TAC, do you feel like the highest needs are rising to the top? I hope silence is a...
It's Aaron.
Yes.
I mean, I think the Route 66 is definitely one that I hear always. So, and then obviously the conversations that have happened with regards to the new hospital location is going to be important. So, but definitely the 66, especially with all the building that's been going on out there.
And you're saying bus route 66 or historic route 66?
Both of them, to be honest with you. I really, that just seems to be a location that I hear people, or I'm having, I often will talk to people about, don't bring a car, maybe you could use the bus, where are you going to live? And then we try to look at the bus routes and see how they can do it. And so there are some places that it just doesn't quite get there. And it's often along all of 66.
Thank you. I think Member Wessel has his hand up.
Yes, thank you, Busy. I'm going to play maybe a little devil's advocate on the new hospital location, because I know, it's already been stated that you guys are really focusing on it, but thinking about your quadrant of, proximity, density, all of those things, and your dependent populations. I'll kind of speak to the dependent populations and want you to speak to the quadrant aspects. So my understanding of the dependent populations was this is a destination that dependent populations need to get to. Therefore, it ranks high. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So how does it rank high on the other, quadrant, walkability, proximity, linearity, density?
Yeah, you're right. Those are definitely some challenges that don't quite, they're not ingredients that are met for that ridership recipe. I agree. And there's so many unknowns, unclear of how walkable, bikeable it might be. I hope it's a long distance. So that definitely lowers that walkability. Unclear how much development will be prompted along that corridor once the hospital moves. Unclear. So I think there's just a lot of unknowns that are really challenging.
Busy,
Yes, please.
or Mr. Chair. So I just want to say, I appreciate the question here, and you're framing it. You're asking the question about what's high ridership and what's transit dependent, as those are your highest priorities. And you have put together the neighborhoods in a way that I think makes sense and is consistent with my understanding of the community, and that you also have the data to back it up. And you've got the graph that explains and demonstrates these really are high priority areas for these reasons. I can certainly appreciate the questions about the future and pedestrian and bicycle access and all these other points that my esteemed colleague brought up. And I can also say that understanding your goals as I do, that I think the way this is framed is correct. And these are your highest priorities.
Thank you.
Lizzie, I do have one comment myself. How does the priority of frequency overlay into this?
Excellent question, Chair Shimoni. So right now we are just in needs assessment. So what needs are rising to the top, and then how do we best address those needs? Is that frequency? Is that span? Is that better bike ped connections? So really identifying the best solution to the problem.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yes.
Any other comments or questions, folks? Great discussion.
Absolutely.
I'm not seeing anything.
Thank you so much. And there's just one more slide, Rhonda. I also want to confirm that would you still rank priorities the same on this next slide? Does anything need to change? Are there other, I think I definitely heard, some of those major destinations component as key information, but just want to confirm this still makes sense to the board and TAC. And I'm just going to call on Director Sweet, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off, and then opening it up if there's any other confirmation or no confirmation.
Thank you. I definitely feel like the priorities are ranking the same for me. I look at the pedestrian and bicycle improvements, and for instance, I live north of the hospital and I live way in the back. And so, it's quite a long walk to the nearest bus stop. And I'm just wondering if we made better access with ped and bike, not given my neighborhood, but just in general, if that would help with the ridership. Other than that, I think that this makes sense to me. And in terms of the conversation we were just having, I think, there's so many unknowns with the hospital and honestly the airport that I just want to keep that top of mind when we move forward, that staying in touch with those boards and making sure that what their vision is in line with what we can do to help with our ridership out there. Thank you.
So this is my last slide. I appreciate any other comments that you might have. Next item is the public input. We will be revisiting the matrix, including the public input if you have additional questions.
I do have a couple comments on this slide. You know, I like the priorities. I think these are each, you know, important in their own ways. You know, support. So I see us trying to target a couple different populations, folks who are dependent on transit, and then folks who would choose to utilize transit, right? And so I look at that big shift topic towards the bottom, convert drivers to transit and reduce emissions. And I remember us having a pretty robust conversation with the TAC and the board a while back. I believe it was in person. It might have been virtually, speaking to how nearly none of us were willing to ride the bus if it wasn't super efficient and regular. And so, yes, we can help those who rely and depend on us, but I think that big shift converting drivers is kind of going to that frequency comment I made, and how that's a huge population. You know, last night the city council discussed the Lone Tree overpass, 7-lane intersections, moving, I think, close to 40,000 projected vehicles in a year. Why aren't we considering, you know, bus only lanes? Why aren't we considering, you know, higher frequency? Mountain Line came up in some of the public comments about, you know, if we want to see lesser developments of this type of sheer size and mass, we need to be investing more in public transportation. And I'm open to that conversation. But I guess I bring that up just to emphasize that I think the big shift that our climate neutrality plan speaks to, and that the council and the city staff are wrestling with the growth that we're experiencing and building for, really goes in line with that priority item. And I'm curious what TAC and board members think about that. But I like for us to also to maybe change our focus a little bit more, or shift our focus to how do we convert drivers to transit? Because if we can do that, we're helping everybody. And then we can always expand the network. But I think that really is where my personal focus goes when I look at this list. Thank you. I know some other folks on this call have thoughts about this, so please do speak up, assuming we have time.
And maybe it'll help understanding what the public said, and just, oh, okay, I do see a hand for Josh.
Go ahead.
Thank you. To Chair Shimoni's point, I almost see the big shift as sort of a byproduct. You know, we're not going to be able to convert drivers to transit and reduce emissions if we don't address the areas with higher ridership potential first. And to meet those first two priority areas is really key. And then the reducing emissions sort of naturally follows. So it's almost a sub priority is the way I view it. So that's sort of why I would support keeping the priority rankings as is. So if there's any thoughts, I'd welcome that as well.
Quick follow-up question for you and for staff and anyone on this call, of course. You know, I guess my question is, if we did have 8-minute frequency, how would that impact our ridership today with the current network without expanding any of the lines? You know, would we have full buses at every stop with people, you know, crowding to get onto the bus, like I see in other countries and other locations? Josh, I guess that's my question or comment back to you is, you know, if we simply had that frequency, like at NAU, where you have full buses on all of our ridership, how would that impact the agency at large without having to expand the network and targeting the highest ridership potential? And I guess my question with the target, like that top topic, that top priority, that target areas with highest ridership potential, is that outside of the current network, Busy?
That is simply a priority. It's just the board and TAC direction.
Okay, and so I think, yeah, I can see what you're saying, Josh, as the big shift almost being underneath that. And I think that there is a lot of overlap in those two then. But yeah, I hear you. Any follow-up thoughts?
Adam, it's Erin.
Yeah.
And so I would love to say that 8-minute frequencies would all of a sudden make the buses in the city full. But the difference between NAU and the city is that we are in a very confined space, right? You're talking about a less than 2 mile, and we literally go in a circle, right? And so everybody's going somewhere within that defined area. I think the difference with the city is you have so many people going in so many different directions. I think that is harder to achieve. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think there's just so many other variations in their destinations and their timing that it's difficult. I mean, if you, again, think about the timing on the university campus, classes all get out at the same time, they all start at the same time. So it's the system that exists, I think, allows us to transit to benefit from that. And I'm not sure the same exists in the city. I mean, size alone is greater. Destinations and origins vary much greater, and timing varies. So I think it would be challenging. I think there may be some routes that allow that more, but I don't know it could be system-wide. It's my 2 cents.
Thank you for that. Other comments or questions about these priority lists or anything that's been spoken to?
Great. Well, I really appreciate that dialogue. I will also remind board and TAC that the 4 remaining priorities are included in the evaluation criteria. So they are going to go into how do we solve these problems? How are we best achieving those goals? So they're incorporated. Just want to make sure. I appreciate hearing that. It sounds like our priorities are still accurate. And with that, I'll move on to the public input. Next slide, please, Rhonda. I'm going to hand over the mic to, I apologize, a few operational challenges. I'm going to move through this very quickly. Next slide. Just wanted to mention that there are some components on current routes that need some attention, and this plan will address that. Really, these are some needs, and just wanted to bring that up. Next slide, and I will be handing the mic over to Monica. Thank you.
Thank you, Busy, and good morning, everyone. Again, Monica Hernandez. I'm with AECOM. I am working on the public involvement effort for Flagstaff in Motion. And as part of my presentation, I will cover the public involvement phase, the timeline associated with it, how we went about soliciting input from our community members, and what we heard. Next slide, Rhonda. Thank you. So the main purpose for engaging the public has to do with really developing a community-driven transit plan. We want for the final product to reflect the needs and priorities of the community. So through this phase 1, public involvement, which took place summer through fall, we focused on asking people about their transit needs and priorities to inform the plan. Next slide. So before I jump into what we heard, I want to highlight how is it that we went about raising project awareness and encouraging community members to share their input, share their ideas with us. So we formed a community advisory committee. The committee includes 16 community members that represent different sectors of the community, business interest, neighborhood, community, special interest groups, and so on. So that committee is in place. We have met twice now, and we will continue to meet with the committee through the development of this plan. They are serving as our soundboard. We take ideas to them before we are sharing them with the public. So that's the Community Advisory Committee. And then we conducted online engagement, which featured surveys. We conducted a survey on Flagstaff's community forum platform. And then we created a platform for this project, which is which is flagstaffinmotion.com. We mailed over 15,000 postcards to Title VI communities, and really the focus, the target for that was the low-income neighborhoods with Spanish-speaking populations. And then the postcard also included a survey by text to allow for those community members that may not be able to go online and participate in a survey to also share their ideas with us to inform the plan. We also distributed posters in the community. They were placed at the NAU Student Union, a number of locations in the community, again, popular locations where we see that foot traffic. So thank you to the many that assisted with allowing for those posters to be placed at their storefronts and so on. We did tabling at the farmers market to engage with people in person, where we had an opportunity to not just talk about Flagstaff in Motion, but also it served as an opportunity to talk about Mountain Lion as a whole and the various services that the agency offers. And we shared information with third-party groups. These are your business interest groups, your neighborhood leaders, community service providers, to allow for project-related information to be shared through their communication channels to, again, increase our reach and so on. So let's talk about the participation. Next slide. So we received input from 256 respondents. This generated a total of 320 comments that I will break down in the next slides. And my breakdown will focus on the overarching themes. Next slide. So let's talk about this word cloud. This word cloud depicts the most popular words that people reference to describe the transit system people want. As you can see, expanded, extensive, accessible, and convenient are some of those key words that stand out when people were asked, so what transit system do you want? How can we form and shape this system to reflect what you want? So these are the key words that came up. Next slide. This pie chart right here depicts basically it represents the various themes associated with the input that we received from the public. A majority of the comments pertain to, and I'll start with the bottom portion of the pie chart, expanding service, bus service coverage to areas that are not served by transit. As you can see from that yellow sliver, that's 56% of the pie chart. The next portion, the next sliver, has to do with increasing bus service frequency to reduce wait times. That's the 12% brownish sliver. And then people also commented on wanting to see an increase in service. In other words, more hours of service. This has to do with hours during weekday and weekends, late and early. That's the light blue sliver, 14%. And then we also heard from the community about making pedestrian and bicycle safety infrastructure improvements, again, to allow for people to make their way to transit in a safe manner, and also to allow for people to bicycle in the community in a safe manner, perhaps those that are bicycling as their connection to transit. So that's the turquoise sliver with 9%. So again, these are the themes that were derived from the various comments that we received. I'm going to the next slide now. This is a bar chart that represents the routes where people want to see an increase in bus frequency. In other words, buses arriving more often. And as you can see from this chart, Route 2, 5, and 66 are the routes that were selected most often when asked this question. So this is where people want to see that increase in frequency. Next slide. This slide has to do with where people want to see expanded bus coverage, where buses are well, it's not expanded coverage, in other words, where service is currently not being provided. As you can see, the top bar represents the areas outside of the Flagstaff city limits. Below each of the bold categories that I've listed in this bar chart, I've identified those specific areas that pertain to those categories. So for example, outside of Flagstaff city limits, we heard about Belmont, the Dooney Park, the Kachina Village areas. This is, again, where people would like to see transit service expanded. We also heard about the airport, the new hospital, Fort Toothill, and then south of the I-40, that Ponderosa Trails area, University Heights also made top of the list for, again, the expanded coverage. And again, the rest of the areas depict where people want to see expanded coverage. Next slide, please. This next pie chart right here has to do with the improvements that we received comment on. These are the improvements that people would like to see made to the system. The largest sliver, the reddish brown, has to do with more bus stops being closer together on existing routes. This is 23% of the pie chart. The next largest sliver has to do with those bicycle and pedestrian roadway infrastructure improvements. That's the turquoise and the lighter brown. So out of this pie chart, those are, and then the more bike racks within the actual transit system are also some of the larger improvements that people want to see. Next slide. This is a summary of what I just referenced. Again, this is what people want. I will start from on the left column from top to bottom, just touching on those different bullets. Again, expanded coverage with the majority being outside of city limits, the airport and major employment centers such as Gore West campus. People also want reduced wait times. In other words, more bus frequency to reduce the wait that they experience at the bus stops. They also want to see an increase in span of service. In other words, more service hours, having more access to transit during weekday and weeknight, weekends, and so on. Also, people commented on the existing routes and enhancing the opportunity for people to be able to safely and conveniently access transit by placing bus stops closer together and adding more bus stops. Again, pedestrian infrastructure improvements such as sidewalks, safe street crossings, bicycle safety infrastructure such as protected bike lanes. That specific example came up as an example of the infrastructure. And improvements at bus stops, again, to enhance the experience for the passenger, to make their experience at a stop more convenient and safe. For example, people want benches in some areas, benches to be made larger, shelters to protect them from rain, sun, wind elements. So this is, again, a summary of what we heard from community. Next slide. So here is what's next with respect to public involvement for this project. So phase 2 is coming up next month, November, December. Our goal, our focus has to do with returning to the community to present an overview of what we heard from the community. This will be an opportunity for community members to validate what we are presenting. What we are presenting will be reflective of the needs and priorities that we heard from the public. The next phase, phase number 3, takes place in early 22. At this point, we begin to present possible solutions that are based on public feedback results and our technical analysis. This will be an opportunity for people to review and share their input. And then phase 4, spring of 2022, we begin to finalize the plan. We come out with our proposed plan. And again, this is an opportunity to gauge where the community stands, for people to share feedback so that we can finalize the plan and that we can proceed with a product that's reflective of both input from our community and sound technical analysis. Next slide.
Thanks, Monica.
Thank you, Busy.
That was great. And after the slide, happy to, if you have any questions for Monica about public input, we can definitely take those. But I just wanted to highlight, bring us back to that priority matrix, combine it with public input. I did not adjust public input on this matrix. So if it was a high communicated need, it is simply identified by highlighting. So there, again, there's some overlap in the high priority based on ridership potential, transit dependent populations. There's also, some disconnect areas outside of the city. We hear that Ponderosa Trails, that people really want transit service in that area. Maybe it doesn't achieve our first two priorities, but we will be looking at all of these options through the evaluation criteria on how they're achieving that ridership, supporting our most vulnerable populations, et cetera. So I want to pause there. This is the last slide before our 5-minute break. So if you have any questions about public input.
Monica, thank you. I'll just throw in my comments really quickly. I just ask that when we communicate outward with in giving updates in regards to where we are, if possible, I think folks know where I'm going with this comment. Some might, we could do that via video communication, like short videos that we can post to our website and social media and YouTube. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. It doesn't need to be, all spiffed up or edited. It could just be one of our wonderful staff members just speaking to some of the, updates and where we're at. Just that visual energy of someone talking in front of a camera, I think goes a lot longer than just a post or a press release or whatever it might be. So if we can integrate video at all, even very simply, I think that'd be wonderful. Thank you. Other comments?
Mr. Chair, this is Shane. I did have my hand up and had a question for Monica. Could we go back a slide or two where you had public feedback on a bar chart? Right there. So do we know, given the broadcasted net, broadly casted net, I guess, seeking public feedback from even areas that are outside of the city's jurisdictional limits, with a response factor of 112 respondents, what would you consider to be statistically valid in that kind of survey? 112 seems to be a bit on the low end, and I just wanted to take all of this with a grain of salt in terms of feedback, and be very careful in terms of what kind of weight we place on this, given the kind of responses that we got. It's good information. It's a good indicator, but I want to be cautious about the validation there. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. One thing I do want to point out is that we recognize that when we are conducting public input, of course, we are subject to the response rate from our community. So with that being said, I also want to share, and I should have mentioned this at the start of my presentation, that aside from the outreach that we conducted, we also focused on making sure that we had a statistically valid sample to work with. So outside of this particular public involvement effort, we also have a social research component that is being driven by a statistically valid component that will also be utilized to inform our plan. So want to make sure that that's known. I know we had referenced that particular during our initial presentation to this board as part of this project. So we will be looking at both elements. Again, that sound statistical valid survey result or social research result in along with the results from this particular effort.
Thank you, Monica. Are you finding that additional effort, the social, what are you calling it?
The social research component.
Thank you. The social research component factor, is it generating results that mirror what you have on this slide in terms of feedback and input? I think it's just important that when we put a slide together like this, that it's qualified. So if you are having this additional outreach component, and it is statistically sound or qualified, and it does mirror this input, that could be an added note to a slide like this to just give additional weight to what is being represented. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment.
And I just wanted to remind the board and TAC that that was Dr. Salop's focus group outreach, and that report was sent, I believe, in June or July to the board and the TAC. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Micah, did you have any follow-up to the comments that were shared?
No, and thank you. I appreciate the comment on this particular topic.
Other comments or questions? Mr. Westall.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick comment in that, I think it's should be somewhat compelling or encouraging that we are seeing the overlap between the data analysis and the public feedback. And I think that should really support the priorities that we're seeing emerge in both the matrix and in the input we received from the board at the beginning of the process. Thank you.
Excellent. Anything else? All right, Busy, I think we're onward to our 5-minute break. I'll let you lead that. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair Shimoni. Yes, 5-minute break. Let's meet back at 10:59. And Rhonda, if you wouldn't mind going to the forward a few slides to the 5-minute break slide, and then we will be resuming with evaluation criteria and DACSHA. So see you in 5 minutes. Thanks.
Hey, guys, the training room is not on mute, just so you're aware.
Yeah, thank you.
Chair Shimoni, it is 10:59. Would you mind if I get started?
Busy, what did you say?
Oh, it's 10:59. Would you mind if I get started?
Oh, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Next slide, please, Rhonda. So I'll be handing it over to Daksha. Just a reminder that the board has reviewed the goals and objectives. And today we're really focusing on the metrics. How do we measure those goals as we identify solutions and put them through this evaluation criteria? So Daksha will do a really great job going through those metrics, but we're open to all comments. So with that, I'll hand it over to Daksha.
Thank you, Busy. So before I dive into the evaluation criteria, I wanted to talk more about the background, why we have developed this draft evaluation criteria and how we plan to use it. Busy gave a great summary of the needs assessment and highlighted some of the priority areas as well as existing routes within the transit system. And Monica provided a good overview of what people want and where they want the service to expand. So based on the findings of the needs assessment and phase 1 public input, we will be coming up with possible solutions, and I'll be referring it as service options. So these service options will be focusing probably on the improvement of level of service of existing routes, and will also include expansion of the transit service, which can be route expansion, adding new areas with different transit mode options, new routes, and route modifications if necessary based on the findings of the needs assessment. So when we have this set of service options, we will be evaluating them further, and that's why we have developed this draft evaluation criteria. So what Busy showed was an evaluation of the whole service area and understanding where the needs are, what the trends are. And through these set of evaluation criteria, we will be focusing more around the route and more around the service options to understand what the ridership potential is, how is the density, how is the walkability, bike and ped infrastructure. So can we go to the next slide? So this evaluation criteria were developed keeping in mind what the goals and the objectives were. And so most of this criteria aligned with the goals. Something I would like to highlight that all this criteria, they somehow overlap with all the goals, but they align with some goals more than the other goals. And as we go down the list, you will see that. All these criteria that we came up with, we wanted it to be measurable so that we can quantify the impact of this existing conditions and future conditions along the service options. And so each evaluation criteria further has 1 or 2 metric, which is mainly data that is quantifiable and it will help us understand the overall impact of that service option on the community. So right now, we have not included cost as a service, as a criteria. And first, we would just like to evaluate the service options or the possible solution based on how they meet the existing and future need as well as demand. And then we will bring the cost factor into picture to understand, like, once we have the priority, like which service option would give the most, would fulfill the most need and demand, then we'll bring in the cost factor to understand the return on investment. So as we go through the slides, please feel free to ask questions, give suggestions, let us know if you're missing any metrics which is important for that criteria or to achieve a certain goal. I think we can go to the next slide and I will dive deep into the criteria. So we have 20 evaluation criteria. All these criteria align to the different goals, that is ridership, accessibility and mobility, equity, sustainability, investment, and living affordability. So as part, I will quickly go down to the list, and on the next few slides, we can talk in more detail about the different metrics associated with each of these criteria. So we have transit efficiency, looking at the efficiency of the current system. When we have those service options, we will also recommend some changes to the frequency if necessary. And so we'll consider that as part of the evaluation. Then transfer opportunities along the existing system. And if we add coverage, how will that provide opportunity to connect to the existing system? Then existing population and employment, future population and employment. Here we are referring to the metro plan model to understand what that future population and employment distribution will be in the service area. Then we'll be looking at activity centers, and here we are referring to the Flagstaff Regional Plan 2030 to understand some of the urban and suburban activity centers within our service area. Additionally, we felt like the destinations are really important. Although we know that there are certain activity centers within the service area, it is important to look at the destinations which is used by the vulnerable population, like youth, senior, people living with disabilities, people under the average poverty line, and minority. So we will be looking at educational institutions, the distribution of that along the corridor, healthcare facilities like clinics, hospital, pharmacies, nursing homes, social service agencies like food centers, centers for family programs. As part of the equity, we'll be looking at the Title VI communities and how they are distributed along that service option, understanding the density. And for that, we'll be looking at the low income population and the minority population. Along with that, there are other transit dependent population, which Busy already touched upon, where based on which we had combined all those population groups together, and we had that equity analysis finding and the equity index map, which showed areas that highlight which highlights denser areas with these population groups. And so there is some overlapping of criteria as well, like some kind of double counting in a way, but you will see that we will probably score them differently, so that we'll kind of score them differently, so that even though there is overlapping, we feel it is important to capture those findings. So we will be looking at the equity index score as well along the corridors. Then from a sustainability perspective, we're looking at the vehicle miles traveled, how implementation of a new transit service or improvement of the transit service will impact the vehicle miles traveled along that corridor. Looking at the active transportation facilities like bike and pedestrian infrastructure, Then existing ridership and projected ridership. This is kind of which touches all the goals, but we have included this under investment, keeping in mind that land use and ridership goes hand in hand. And so an improvement in or better coordination of land use policies and transit service will definitely help with improvement of the ridership. So we'll be looking at existing ridership and projected ridership, and also some of the future and emerging developments. And we are depending on the database from the city of Flagstaff to understand where new developments are coming up in the corridor. Additionally, we'll be looking at the living affordability part through understanding which how many households along the corridor are car free, and looking at affordable housing. This involves public housing plus as affordable renting. And then lastly, we will use the feedback that we receive from the public and the stakeholder. Next slide, please. Okay, so rider experience, transit efficiency, looking at the peak and off-peak hour frequency of bus routes, current bus route performance, that is the on-time performance of bus routes, understanding if there are delays, and if there are delays, why there are delays, and also the span of service of the bus route. For how many hours a day do we have, does this route serve the community? Then transfer opportunities. This is this also touches on the accessibility and the mobility goal, but it also touches on the rider experience. And that's why we have transfer opportunities here, where we understand the number of intersecting bus routes, providing transfer opportunities to a rider. And then we also look at transfer opportunities within 5 to 10 minutes after getting down at a bus stop. So for example, if route 2 intersects with route 66, then how long does a rider have to wait before transferring to route 66? So we will be considering that as well, and identifying that. Something to note that once we start looking at the evaluation criteria, we will also understand which existing routes are not doing well in certain criteria, and then the agency can focus on improving or taking steps to make that criteria better for that particular transit route. So I'll just pause here and I'll see if anyone has questions for these first two evaluation criteria.
Any questions? Doctor, you're doing great. I don't see.
Okay. We can move on to the next slide then. Then existing population and employment, future population employment, all these criteria we will be looking at within 1/4 mile of the transit stop. What happens, we usually end up looking 1/4 mile along the route, but it's not helpful if it's along the route and there's no bus stop there. So we are also considering that walkability aspect. So 1/4 mile is considered as a good, or I would say a comfortable distance for a person to walk or bike. And so we are using that criteria, I would say that factor for all these criteria when we evaluate those service options. So for the activity centers I mentioned before, these are local and regional activity centers identified by City of Flagstaff in their 2030 plan. Then educational institutions, we are looking at schools, colleges, universities within 1/4 mile of transit stops. Healthcare facilities, hospitals, urgent cares, nursing homes, clinics, pharmacies, and social service agencies, all within 1/4 mile of the transit stop. Again, I'll pause here. Just a reminder, these evaluation criteria are to understand and to help with the accessibility and mobility goal. Okay, we can probably move on to the next slide. So equity, so providing transit service for people of all ages, abilities, and background. And this is where we have considered the Title VI communities, the transit dependent populations, that is people with living with disabilities, senior and youth, and the equity index score. So this equity index score, just a little background about this. We have conducted the equity analysis where we combine all the different population groups and understood which areas have a high equity index score compared to the other areas. And so when we look at the service options, we will consider like how many census block groups does that service option touch or serve, and based on that we will be scoring the option. And that's just one criteria, but the options will be scored on for all the criteria. Any questions on this slide or the metrics? Do we need to add any more metric to this goal? Okay, we can move on to the next slide. So sustainability. So here, when we came up with this evaluation criteria, we were trying to understand what criteria can be measurable, because there can be different factors of sustainability, like GHG emissions as well. But what is more related to transit, and how can it be measurable as part of this plan and study? And so we have only considered vehicle miles traveled and active transportation facilities. And we are open for discussion to understand if there are any other measurable metric that can be associated with a route or a new service route and measured to score that route. Okay, so I can just quickly touch on the active transportation facilities. Here we are looking at sidewalks, bike lanes, enhanced crossings, and foottrail.
Actually, I do have a question about the vehicles miles traveled component. So it's comparisons of new vehicle miles traveled to existing vehicles miles traveled. I'll just say that the city's goal is to reduce vehicles miles traveled. So I wonder how we overlay the climate neutrality plan in our city's goals with it, because it's not just new compared to existing. I think existing is a number we're hoping to see head in the other direction than what it's heading in today, which is up. But is that something you're taking into account?
Yeah, so what we are planning to do is we are going to use the metro plan model to understand future traffic congestions or future traffic patterns. And when a service option is introduced, whether it is a new route like the hospital airport route, or whether it is an improvement in frequency where there is higher chances of ridership increasing, we will be understanding how will that service option then impact the vehicle miles traveled along that corridor. So if you have a certain number now, and once that new service option is introduced for 2040 or within the next 5 years, we are trying to capture the next 5 years as well as 2040 and understand what impact it has on the vehicles mile traveled, whether it has a small impact or a big impact. And from just a professional understanding, if there is an improvement in just the frequency, then the impact will be considerably small. But if there is an introduction of a new service route, then the impact will be larger. And that is what we are trying to capture here. Does that help?
It does. I think my only concern, and I'll leave this here, is just that when we look at 2040 projected numbers, from my understanding, at least at the city, we're doing it through the lens of we're expecting this amount of growth, therefore it results in this many cars. And we're hoping with this big shift in the mode shift that we're implementing, that those projections change. But I think I'm okay with what you expressed. So thank you for that explanation.
Yeah, and that's what we'll see, how those projections change with those improvements. That's the goal here.
Right, thank you.
Any other questions on this slide or suggestions? Okay, we can go to the next slide. So investment, as I mentioned, ridership, existing ridership and projected ridership, understanding what is the potential of ridership along that new service or an improvement of service, and then looking at future developments along that route to see how density will increase. And so because increase in development or improvement in development along the routes impacts existing, impacts population and employment as well. So ridership and investment here go hand in hand. So I would like to understand or pose a question that if there are any other metrics that we should consider to understand the impact of investment along corridors. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So living affordability, here we are looking at the number of households within the 1/4 mile of the transit stops that are car-free households who totally depend on transit at this point for any of their traveling. And the next thing is we'll be looking at affordable housing, whether the existing routes or the service options that will be recommended will serve all this affordable housing within Flagstaff. So we'll be looking at the public housing buildings, existing public housing buildings, upcoming affordable housing as well. And we are also looking at affordable renting options out there that the city of Flagstaff has on their webpage, mentioning different locations around the city. And so the goal will be to understand how many affordable housing and renting options does the service route serve. Any questions? We were trying our best to have these criteria and metric more measurable. But if there are any qualitative criteria or metrics that we need to consider for living affordability, then please let us know. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the last slide for the evaluation criteria. After that, we'll be talking about some of the weights for the different criteria. So this is feedback, that is stakeholder input and public input. And as we develop the service options, we will be asking questions to the stakeholders as well as public about which service options do they prefer for frequency, for expansion, for a new transit mode. And based on the ranking and the number of votes that we get for the different options, we will include that in our evaluation and accordingly measure the likelihood of people using or wanting that service option.
Daksha, sorry to jump in. Can you go back a slide?
Sure.
Still processing.
No problem.
Okay, so under affordable housing, number of public housing buildings within a 4th mile of transit stops, number of affordable renting within a 4th. Are we taking, when we talk about affordable renting, are we talking about, a certain level of AMI, average medium income, and I guess what size of a complex would, qualify to be part of this matrix?
Okay, so City of Flagstaff has listed different properties around Flagstaff that are available for affordable renting, and they have different programs for that renting. And it does depend on, some of them does depend on the level of your income. And I think you have to show some proof to get those benefits of those programs for that affordable renting. But we are just using that list of properties around the city to understand what renting options are out there that are affordable for the people living there, and whether they can access transit around that affordable renting or housing.
Is it that?
Go ahead.
I had heard about a website that allowed service providers to use in town to try to find low-income housing for individuals in need.
Yeah.
Is that the same website that kind of like shows all that lower income housing or affordable housing?
Yes, it is. And I can paste that website here in the chat after I'm done with this
Right.
section.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Yep. Rhonda, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so these are just recommended weights for the different criteria, and this is based on our professional understanding of which criteria are important to understand the impact of a new transit service or an improved transit service, and also by understanding the needs within the community from the Mountain Line staff. So when we are rating a criteria high, that means it will have the highest possible points. For example, consider the high having as 15 points and the medium having 10 points and the low having 5 points. So if a service option is evaluated for transit efficiency, the most possible points that it can achieve is 15. And for the other criteria, it can achieve 10 or 5. And so the intention is to get those scores for the different criteria and bring it all together and get a final score for that service option. How this will help is based on the score, we will understand the ranking of the service options. It will help us prioritize like which service option best meets the community's need and future demand. And then we will bring cost into this overall evaluation process. So any questions or comments about this, like transit efficiency and transfer opportunity, which goes back to the ridership experience, is weighted high. Population, employment, activity centers, all these are important. All the criteria are important, but now we are trying to prioritize and understand which criteria should be weighted higher than some of the other. For example, projected ridership. This is based on the Metroplan model and its future, and it has a lot of assumptions considered in that model and even in our analysis of ridership. And that's why we have weighted it much lower, because at the end of the day, it is just a number in the future and it's based on a lot of assumptions. For affordable housing, yes, affordability is a concern that has been brought up in Dr. Fred Solop's research as well. And so we have weighted it as high. Then within equity, like Title VI communities, that is low income and minority, this is based on the FTA regulation, and that's why it has been rated high. But of course, there are other transit dependent population as well, which is rated low, which is rated medium, sorry. So we'll pause here and I'll just let people go through the list and feel free to ask questions or suggest any changes to the recommended weights based on the community understanding. Okay, I don't see any questions here. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so then I'll pass this on to Bob, who will be talking about the potential funding sources. Thank you all.
Hi, it's Bob Peskin. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. So let's go on to the first funding slide, which is not showing up on my screen. Hang on a second.
And Bob, this is Darren. This is the financial sketch planning model approach overview slide. If you can't see it. Oh, Bob, you put yourself on mute, it looks like.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry for the technical problems. So we're going through a modeling approach to look at the capacity of Mountain Line to implement the types of operational changes that Daksha's been discussing and which Busy introduced earlier in the conversation today. We've set up this examination of funding needs that leverages the data that's coming out of this project and other off-the-shelf data, particularly data about Mountain Line's financial situation. And we're looking out into what we're calling a typical future year rather than doing a year-by-year cash flow analysis. And the reason for that is we're really uncertain about when projects will be implemented and should new funding sources be required, exactly what the timeline is for the implementation of any new funding sources, including just how we pick what particular funding source would be used. So we're looking at a year of operating expenses and revenues and an annualized capital cost and revenues. And the analysis comes down to a very simple question. How much money would we need to have available in that typical year to pay for operations and to pay for capital? Relatively straightforward examination. Let's go to the next slide. To do this, we're taking the FY22 Mountain Line budget, which gives us an understanding of what the cost is to deliver a mile and an hour of service. We're looking at the proposed strategic investment plan, and some results that I'll show you shortly looks at the entirety of that strategic investment plan with a couple of exceptions. We're not including bus rapid transit at this point, although we have it set up so we could. We're not looking at expansion of electric buses at this point, although we have it set up so that we could. And we're making some gross assumptions about some particular project types that may be funded by others, like traffic signal preemption projects, which we're assuming the city would pay for the non-federal share. We bring all of this information together, the current financial situation and the current service, and we overlay on top of that any changes to the current service that's coming out of the operations planning of this project. And the whole point of this is to provide some insights about financial capacity, and to the extent that we need additional funding, to help the decision making in terms of what source or sources might be applied and how dependent we might be on those sources. Next slide. You can click again. Okay, so the model takes the set of improvements, route by route improvements, underlying capital program improvements. Next, click again. And subtracts out the funding that's already in place, what's currently funding the operating budget, known sources of funding in the capital program in terms of both federal funding and non-federal funding. Click again. And this results then in an identified funding gap. And this gap would be the result of an expanded capital program and additional services. Click again. We then look on the capital side, because we're looking at an annualized cost, we're looking for the non-federal share that Mountain Line would be responsible for, leveraging future revenues. So we're going through a relatively simplified debt financing calculation. Click again. To determine what the additional funds required would be. Now, we recognize that Mountain Line itself cannot issue debt. So the assumption at this point is that it would be the city that's issuing the debt, but perhaps leveraging revenue streams that are not currently in place. Click again. We look at a variety of potential funding sources, which I'll list in a subsequent slide. And what the model does is it says, given this tax base, which might be retail sales or assessed real estate assessed value or number of licensed vehicles, the model determines what rate of taxation would be necessary to pay for the financing. Now, the left unlimited, the model may result in finding a rate of taxation that could not possibly be considered. So we make some assumptions about what the maximum reasonable rate might be, and then test against that maximum rate. And I'll explain this a bit further when I show you some sample results in a couple of slides. And we do this across the various funding sources that we've identified, which I'll also summarize in the following slides. Next slide. By the way, you can think about this model that we've developed as it's not really dissimilar from a typical mortgage affordability calculator that you might see a bank provide that tests how much of a home you could purchase based on your income and other aspects of your financial statement. It's very similar math that we're applying here. The funding sources that we're looking at is a fairly broad set, including the sources that are currently applied, like the current sales tax and various formula grants that you're getting from the federal government and fair revenue. And we're looking at a variety of potential sources. Most of these sources are already applied in other transit agencies around the country, including agencies of your size. So down in the transportation related taxes and fees, we're looking at a vehicle miles travel tax, which would be a replacement for the gallonage tax that the state of Arizona currently applies. We're looking at an increment to the vehicle license tax, which we're calling vehicle registration fee here, which should just be an increment to the fee that the state and the county and the city already apply. A couple other interesting sources are in earlier meetings with our stakeholders, a tax on marijuana or cannabis sales came up as a possibility, and we've actually been able to quantify what that rate of taxation would have to be should it be selected. We also look at some pure real estate related fees, which are interesting to look at, although given the scale of the projects that we're talking about, would probably just pay for transfer center type of improvements. But looking at fees paid by developers as or landowners as a potential source is something else that we're considering. We're certainly open to considering other sources. The key thing is we need to be able to quantify the size of the revenue stream, either the tax base or if it's an intergovernmental grant, what that revenue stream would be. Next slide. Similar to the evaluation of service alternatives, we have a set of evaluation criteria to determine the appropriateness of the funding sources that we're considering. And some of the words that you see here are kind of similar to what Daksha was talking about. There's four major ones, and I would point out that these ways of evaluating potential funding sources have been used all over the country, and indeed they've been used in two congressional commissions that examined transportation funding about 10 or 12 years ago. Very similar approach to what we're doing here. The first is yield. Is it simply generating enough revenue? And is it reliable? Is it a source that we can depend upon? The second is equity. again, a consideration that Dr. raised earlier. In this context, what's the impact on low-income households? And I'll talk about this a bit more in the context of the sales tax, which is a regressive tax. It has a lower impact, has a greater impact on low-income households. The administrative criterion is just looking to see, is the tax already collected, or will a whole new mechanism need to be put in place to collect this tax? So an increment to the existing sales tax, your major source of dedicated funding, is relatively straightforward. Establishing an entirely new tax, like say a tax on rental cars, while transit agencies have done this, one is in the Raleigh-Durham area, for example, in North Carolina. It means that all of the burden for collecting the tax goes to Mountain Line. So it's an important consideration. And then finally, the legal considerations. Are there barriers to the implementation of a new source? Is it prohibited by the state constitution, by statute? Does it require voter approval, for example? So these are the four criteria. And in the next slide, we've done an initial review of the various funding sources that I previously identified in terms of these criteria. Now, this is a first pass. And what you'll see in general is that sources toward the top of the list, which are the more commonly applied ones throughout the country, are rating, more of them are rating high or medium, and the ones toward the bottom of the list are more of them are rating medium or low. But for your particular circumstance, we can see where there's some room for discussion. And perhaps that would be a good place to take a quick pause right now and just see if there are any comments about any of these sources and any of the initial evaluation ratings that we've applied to them.
Thank you, Robert.
I'm in it now.
Yeah.
Yes.
Comments, questions? Are people still awake?
Yeah, I'm here.
No, I'm joking. I'm talking to the board.
Okay. Okay.
I know that there's probably some thoughts out there. Maybe not.
Okay. Well, look, we're certainly willing to address this. It's very easy for us to consider additional sources or to knock out sources from consideration. Again, the key issue is we need to have an understanding of what's the current size of the tax base, or if it's an intergovernmental grant, just how much revenue in a typical year we're talking about. Relatively minimal data requirements. All right, so let's go on to the next. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I hate to interrupt. Do you mind trying to wrap up? We're running a little bit late. I want to make sure we have time for discussion.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Very good. All right, let's. I'll try to get done, say, in the next 3 minutes. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So let's keep going. Next slide. Okay. So we'll go through the various service options that are emerging out of the service planning work. We're going to look at various combinations of funding to make the financial plan work, keeping the estimated rate of taxation within a quote reasonable level. And we may get some feedback from the board in terms of what's reasonable and what combinations of funding make sense. We're going to show you in the next couple of slides a couple of those combinations that we've examined. Next slide. We've been directed to consider Mountain Line participating in the city's anticipated green bond. We've set up the financial analysis to consider out of a $20 million green bond, $1 million would be applied for the replacement of existing buses. This is something that Mountain Line would pay for out of its tax revenues. If it's $1 million, that's roughly 10,000 hours of service, or about 13% of the current service that's being delivered, just to provide you some scale of what we're talking about. So, for the same $1 million, you could pay the non-federal share of some buses, or pay for 10,000 hours of additional service per year. Next slide. We've also been directed to consider the creation of a rural transportation authority to address potential services outside the current service area. That would most likely be a county responsibility. And our anticipation would be the county would rely on some combination of its three largest revenue sources: property tax, sales tax, or the vehicle license tax. Next slide. We did an initial application of the tool across these various funding sources. This is very preliminary and before the service planning has been done. We're looking at 6,200 additional hours. And we're looking, as I mentioned, at a partial implementation of the strategic investment program set of capital projects. This is summarized on the next two slides. So click ahead one slide. The columns on the right are 8 different combinations of funding sources. The upper half, each column totals to 100%. So looking at the first combination in scenario 1, we're saying that 62% of the additional funding would come from a sales tax, and 32% would come from a property tax. That results in a 10% increase in, a 0.10% increase in the property tax. That's on top of the existing Mountain Line 0.295% tax, and the city's 2% tax, and the county's 1.3% tax, and the state's 5.6% tax. We're talking about an additional 0.1%. And a 7 cents per $100 increase in the real estate tax, and that's on top of the current Flagstaff real estate tax of $1.67 per $100 of assessed value. So that's just one combination, and we looked at initially at 8 different combinations, and we could look at more various combinations of sales tax, property tax, vehicle license tax, a cannabis tax, and a vehicle miles travel tax. Interestingly, if you look all the way over to the right, if we relied entirely on a vehicle miles travel tax, it would be a tax of about $0.004 per mile, or 0.4 cents per mile to pay for that source. The next slide shows what the dollar impact per year would be on the typical household or home or vehicle. So my first combination, relying entirely on a sales tax and property tax, it's an additional $55 in sales tax paid per household per year, an additional $388 in property tax paid per year. The incidence of the tax depends on how many households or how many homes or how many vehicles we're talking about. Again, we can look at any number of combinations. It's very easy in the model to set this up. When we do all of this on the final financial plan, we'll come up with a set of options, and it'll then be up to the stakeholders to agree with what we're seeing, and ultimately with the board to decide on which funding sources to pursue. I think I'll stop at this point, see if there's any further questions.
Excellent, thank you.
Oh, Bob,
Go
I'll
ahead.
jump in. Rhonda, if you want to go to next slide. We have a couple, we're going to jump into questions here to wrap this up related to the financial piece. So Bob has a question here on this slide for all of us, but then I wanted to tie in a couple final questions that I think can all be considered together. And that is, if you go back to what Heather talked about, if you remember a couple hours ago, about the current state of our funding. and you're thinking about the needs that were presented today, I guess we're looking for like some gut checks as well on if you hear needs that we really need to address and find funding for. Again, the state of the fund balance doesn't allow for many expansions of service, like everything we've talked about today. And so are these needs things that the board would like to see us potentially consider tax, or asking the voters if they would like to tax themselves for? We would obviously do a bunch more research. We're not looking for a final answer today. But as you're considering, I think this question of what types of taxes are appealing, also the question of how badly do you think we need to address these needs? Do we need to consider something for 2022? And then I think that can just take us to the end of this discussion. So thank you, and sorry for the rush at the end.
Director Williams, would you like to chime in?
No, I just turned on my video towards the end of the meeting here. I don't have any comments.
Okay, I'll just throw out that, I hypothetically, am open to the idea of a ballot initiative on 2022's ballot. It's definitely getting close to go time to move something like that forward. I like the idea of overlapping this topic with our sustainability efforts on the ballot, potential ballot initiative. There might be room for collaboration between the two, and that might be what it takes to get this through and passed by the public as a secondary property tax. But yeah, Aaron, did you have something to add?
Yeah, and I'm glad that you chimed in first, Adam, because I am not as well. I know that often when we look at this, we also are balancing it with anything that the city is looking to do. And so I don't know where that stands. So that was my only thought. But as a taxpayer, I know that we've had support in the past. I know our last go around didn't go well, but I think that we can do things a little bit differently. So I think it would be good to, and to your point, if we're going to do it, we need to start now. I think that would be a good option to look at.
I will just add that my gut is feeling like 2022 might be a little too soon. We did have an infrastructure retreat a few weeks ago, and there is quite a few other things that we're thinking about putting on the ballot. Not sure if it's 2022 or 2024. Shane, please do jump in if you have, or Councilmember Sweet. But I definitely think a ballot initiative is where my gut goes when I think about the funding needs. But yeah, Shane, please.
That would be the question to answer, just what you said. So I don't know that. I think it has to be just in collaboration with the city.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and members of the board and TAC. Really appreciate the discussion, the question. Obviously, we live in a world where resources really never come to meet the full demand of the need. It's like a blanket that's always too short. Either your toes are hanging out getting cold or your shoulders are getting cold. It doesn't matter if you tug or pull, it just seems to not be enough. That said, in addition, just adding on to what Chair Shimoni mentioned, the council did recently have an infrastructure retreat, setting the stage really for what questions or question the council might be inclined to entertain as a ballot question for 22. And I'll just set the stage this way. I mean, the projects, when you factor critical needs in terms of water, wastewater, in terms of our public safety, in terms of stormwater, with the high demand that's been placed on our backs in response to the museum flood, the Rio de Flag project, just a litany of projects that surfaced in this retreat, and the price tags associated with those projects. It's quite daunting, and I don't envy the position the council's in to have to, at the end of the day, make a decision on what question gets put out there. But we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars worth of critical infrastructure that, at the end of the day, really aren't questions. Do we do it or don't we do it? It's when and how do we do it, kind of thing. So I would kind of echo Councilmember Shimoni's comment that maybe it's a 2024 goal, and as Mountain Line, we start advertising that, so we're getting it out to the rest of the public that we're looking pretty seriously at a 2024 question, and get serious about what that question is, and use this next year or two as lead time into that ballot, so the rest of the community knows where we're heading as a transit authority, and where we're hoping to get the community to rally support around. But for 2022, I mean, my personal comment, I don't know if Councilmember Shimoni or Councilmember Sweet have a different perspective, but that slate is going to be pretty full in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Daly. And you know, just to add to that, you know, this is a hot topic today in the community. This topic of vehicles, miles traveled, bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, bus mobility and opportunity. So, you know, just thinking about last night's council meeting and all the public comments and council comment that we had and dialogue, a part of me feels like now's the time, right? We have a window now. I'm sure that window will still be open in a couple of years, but this is a hot topic in the community today. So it might be worth exploring to some degree for the short term, but yeah, it's time is of the essence. But yeah, other comments, other questions?
I'm sorry, I would just add, I mean, I would, and I'm not disagreeing at all with what was just said. I would just add that, you know, if it was an independent decision by Mountain Line to put if you were an independent taxing authority, you know, I couldn't disagree at all with what Councilmember Shimoni mentioned. But at the end of the day, this would be wrapped up to all the consideration that the council will have to make as it relates to what question or questions get put on this ballot for 2022. So I just, that is something to factor in. Mountain Line is not an independent taxing authority, but would rely on the council to give its blessing whether or not a question ends up making it on the ballot. Which is why I kind of suggested maybe being very vocal about targeting 2024's ballot, and start working with elected officials to secure a spot on that ballot. I think that would potentially help council weigh in on what questions are asked this round, knowing that Mountain Line would be looking at 2024 for a serious question. Anyway, that's just my strategic thinking at play, but it is ultimately a council decision. Thank you.
And I'll just say, I don't know if I'll be on that council, but I can speak to the short term and just say that, you know, I think it'd be important that Mountain Line staff keep an eye on the council agendas where we do discuss future ballot initiatives, and Shane and our team, we can make sure that we include a bullet point for Mountain Line as a discussing point on, and in those discussions around the future ballot initiatives, so that council can weigh in and have the opportunity to consider this. Because I personally like to see this on that ballot in 2022. I think that this would pass in 2022. And I think that, you know, it's going to be a tough decision by council. And if Councilmember Sweet has anything to add, please do jump in. I know she's got something else to be at 12. But Heather, please go ahead.
Thanks for giving me just a moment. I wanted to just share that we're very conscious and aware of that we need to work with city staff, city manager, and then council on whatever goes before the voters. Our goal is to really be sure about that timing. Shane, to one point, if we wait till 2024, we also need to consider the impacts on renewal questions, because again, as I pointed out earlier, our tax does sunset in 2030. And so we are, as staff, are just really trying to walk through all of those questions and walk through all those questions with our board as it relates to what we might want to do in Flagstaff in Motion. What is the timing of the various ballot questions that our community might be asked to consider. So I hope, Shane, I'm acknowledging your comments, but explaining some of the viewpoints that we've had as we've considered what is the best timing for any future tax questions that we take to the public with the city.
Thank you for that, Heather. Director Sweet, are you able to jump in, or would you like to add a couple comments?
So just listening to the conversation, my gut is telling me that 2024 would be a better shot on getting this as on the ballot. You know, just we have a lot of heavy lifts ahead of us, this being one of them, but prioritizing and where I think council will be, I do agree with Shane that maybe prepping and getting us all ready, knowing that this will be our ask for 2024.
And quick follow-up for you, Heather. So you said that renewal will be due. When would Mountain Line want to see that on the ballot? Would that be 2028, 2026, 2030?
Historically, we've gone 2020 in the 16 year, the 16, to give us that opportunity to go back in the 8 or the 18 if it failed back 2006. That's what occurred. We went in 6, it failed. We had to go back in 8. And then in 16, we went for a renewal and it was passed. And then of course, attempted to expand it in 18 and that did not. So those are all the factors that we take in, but of course that we need to walk through that with the city management's office, with our board, with city council. But if we wait till 2028 to ask the question and it fails, essentially in 2030, we don't have the funding we need to provide service in 2030. And so that feels a little too close to the sunset clause for us. 2024 sounds a little early to go with a renewal. But going back to back, I don't know if that's in our favor either. And so I think those are just the different aspects that we have considered and looked at. I did want to speak just briefly on the green bond. We're not talking about going out separately. We have talked to the city manager about working with the team that's working on this potential green bond issue to ensure transit is one of the funded mechanisms under that green bond issue. So wanted to clarify that particular item, we're not talking about separate from what the city is already doing, but how we could partner on that bond issue.
So really quick, and Shane, I see you. It sounds like 2022 or 2024 is really our opportunity for this topic. And then 26, 28 are going to be our opportunities for the renewal.
That's our sense.
Go ahead, Shane.
Yeah, thank you. And Heather, I haven't been a part of the conversations that you may have had directly with our city manager, Greg Clifton. So anything that I've said here that might contradict that, again, please take it in perspective. I appreciate those conversations and that they occur and that you guys have that kind of relationship. So that's awesome. There are advisors, professional advisors on this. Fred Solip, Mr. Solip, definitely one of them. You might consider wrapping the renewal in with this at a first go at, and knowing that you've got another election or two down the road to revisit that one question on renewal if you need to. So maybe look at 2024 as being the big year with the big ask, and knowing that you've got 2026, 2028 to revisit the renewal if for some reason that didn't make the final cut with the voters. Just a quick thought I had as I was hearing your discussion. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Other comments or questions? I know we're basically out of time. I guess I'll just say in closing on this topic, I think we should explore 2022 and 2024 for this. And then I like what Shane was saying about that bigger ask too. I think we need to explore all the options that are on the table. It's never going to be easy. This is never going to be an easy, low-hanging fruit decision, we'll have to figure out how to squeeze this in and when is the right time to do that. But the clock is ticking for 2022, that's for certain. Heather or Kate, are we ready to move forward, or where are we?
Yeah, we are ready to move forward. I will note that I see Miles has his hand up.
Oh, please go ahead.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, this is Jeff Milebach. Was that for me?
I'm not sure, but Jeff, please go ahead.
Okay, well, I just want to say I really appreciate the discussion, hearing the different perspectives. You're all, together well aware of the dynamics at play and the difficulty of these decisions. I certainly don't have the answers, except to say, as Metro Plan, we want to, support and engage in this dialogue. And we are in the midst of our regional transportation plan. So to the extent that that can be of service to some of the decision making that you all have to do, I hope it can really add value, and we look forward to going through that process with you.
That's great. Thank you for that. And Jeff, do you have any thoughts about 2022 versus 2024?
Mr. Chairman, I have thoughts about everything. And in fairness, I think these are really important questions, and I would need to put my mind to it a bit more and hear some more information before I could, really provide anything other. You're asking the right questions, and that's the best thought I can offer right now. I think it's really important discussion.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Deputy City Manager Daly, we'll have to make sure that we're talking about this whenever we talk about ballot initiatives moving forward, just to allow council the opportunity to weigh in,
I would suggest that if Mountain Lion if it's the intent of the board to push a question for 2022, that indication reach formally the city manager's office as soon as possible, so that in fact it could get wrapped into those conversations. I don't think it would be appropriate for me to be that formal voice. I think it should come from Heather, maybe you, Mr. Shimoni, as the chair of the board. Somehow formally that should get communicated to the city manager directly. I would also say that if it's the intent that Mountain Lion, and I think I'm still in my mind in this camp, to really target a 2024 election ballot, that too gets out there really quick to the city manager's office in a formal way, and then to just carry that message in the community that we have these needs as an organization. The community is demanding these services, and we're targeting the 2024 election year to bring a solution at play for the voters to weigh in on. And just be very out there about your intent to have a question for the voters to consider in 2024, even at this early stage, because I do think it requires that kind of planning in your position as a transit authority to really get out there and make sure that the slate is making way for the question that you need to play out for the voters. Thanks.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful. And I'll just add this last tidbit as we wrap this conversation up. I do have folks reaching out to me today trying to repeal and put back on the ballot the 420, the bridge, the Lone Tree overpass. And I'm not in favor of that myself. And I'm trying to discourage them from doing that. And I'm just thinking if we did put something on the 2022 ballot, that would give them something to champion rather than something to attack, which is that Lone Tree overpass. So again, it is a hot topic today. I do see value in waiting till 2024. I see value in both. I really do. But we can explore it as a board, maybe at our next board meeting, Heather and Kate, and we can then come up with a formal approach to how we want to handle this. But really appreciate the dialogue here today. Heather or Kate, anything else on this?
No, I think we're good with step in motion. Just to confirm, this was planned for November to really have this deep discussion so that we could get a request before the winter break to the city. So more to come on that, and we look forward to closing out that topic. I think, Mr. Chairman, we're ready to move on to progress reports. And I think the only thing there is the summary of current events. So if Rhonda wants to just go a couple ahead, I wanted to share that we are, oops, can you go back one, Rhonda? We are in the midst of celebrating our 20th anniversary. And these are just a couple of our social media posts that have been shared by Jackie. If you've missed them, I wanted to share them with you. That picture is our esteemed Mr. Jeff Malbeck at our service launch of Mountain Line in 2001. If you'll click ahead, there's just a couple more of them. This is from one of our drivers sharing a photo that they have taken of our bus at our new facility here. Next slide, or next. This is our 2013 Transit System of the Year, just one of the many memories that we've been able to share. And there's only a couple more. I want to respect your time, so Rhonda, you can just click through the couple of others. I encourage you to visit our social sites if you haven't, to see some of these photos, to see some of these stories. And if you have any memories that you'd like to share, please send them to us so that we can continue sharing these as part of our month-long celebration of 20 years of Mountain Line. And then last, just a reminder that we have sent out an order form for some of our 20th anniversary swag, some clothing items that we encourage all of you to wear and show your support of Mountain Line in our community. So take a look at that order form. Let us know if there's something of interest to you. Jackie is seeking them by 3:30 today. So if you could just take a quick peek, we sure would appreciate it. And that's all I have for my quick update, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. Well, it's been a really great day and a great conversation. Thank you to all of our.
Wait, Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, respectfully, I'm sorry for the interrupt, but there was no applause at 20 years. I think that's worthy of some, like, let your guard down and do a little shout of hooray. I mean, that is so awesome. It really is. Anyway, sorry for the interrupt, but I'm applauding all the way around, Heather and team. Great job. Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you, everyone.
Shane. Folks, if you are still alive and with us, please do turn your camera on if you can. I'd love to see everybody's faces one last time to celebrate the 20 great years of work and the work that we've done today. And all of us who are a part of this effort today, moving us forward on these really hard topics during these challenging times in the community. Really proud of this team in this virtual climate that we're working together on and of our leadership. So thank you all so much. Congratulations to all of us. As Shane mentioned, thank you. Check out those social media posts, share them where you can. Let's get the word out and let's work towards another strong 20 years. With that, we are adjourned. Thank you all. Good to see everyone's faces and have a great rest of your day.